and I'm really very, very happy to, well, introduce, I can't say introduce, but to have Christina Busse with her keynote. You've all met her in the last few days. She was very active in the discussions, so everybody knows that she is not only a fan study scholar, but also a media fan, and she has her, I think, in the way I got to know you now, she has a very own way of working with her own fandom, which I think is really interesting and important for fan scholarship or for popular culture scholarship overall. Her primary research, as you know, is on fan fiction and fan cultures, and her work has appeared in various collections and journals, including Cinema Journal, Camera Obscura, and Popular Communication. She's also founding co-editor of the online peer-reviewed academic journal Transformative Works and Culture that was founded in 2008. She's the author of Framing Fan Fiction. I think that's what the book we read when we decided to invite you. And she is co-editor of Fan Fiction and Fan Communities in the Age of the Internet that was published in 2006. She also published on Sherlock and transmedia fandom and published the Fan Fiction Studies Reader from 2014. And right now she is co-authoring Fan Fantasies and the Politics of Desire, which I think sounds really intriguing. Yes. And if everything goes well, she will be in Zurich for a workshop in July. So let's hope that this will be possible. And everybody is, of course, invited to join us. Thank you very much, Christina, for being.
Thank you. Thank you. I was very intimidated, especially when I realized I was the last person. I now know, thanks to Wendy and Christina, that I'm not the only person who loves spoilers. So some of my comments may be more defensive than they need to be. Okay, as I was preparing this talk and looking over the other abstracts, I was mostly struck by the implicit assumption shared in general, and it seemed in many of the talks: spoilers are bad. They're clearly bad in terms of the aesthetic experience, which gives a substantial power to the authors, creators to create a specific experience for the audiences that can be marked by spoilers. But they're also bad in a more, I have several things, let me check. Yeah, there we go. They're also bad in a more nebulous ethical sense. So I actually went and looked up to spoil in the OED. When we go back, it goes back to the 14th century with dozens of variations of violent encounters in which the assailant may strip, plunder, ravage, and pillage. Contemporary use tends to be more metaphorical, but the damage remains substantial, offering synonyms for terms like destroy, ruin, and invalidate. We spoil, destroy a tasty dish when we add too much salt. We spoil, ruin a wedding by making an embarrassing scene. We spoil, invalidate a ballot by not filling it out properly. Those are some pretty high stakes. And it places the person who spoils into the role of aggressor, and the act being committed as clearly a morally suspect one, an act one ought not to do. Furthermore, if the act of spoiling is aesthetically and ethically suspect, what does that say about a person who enjoys spoiling and being spoiled? So, as I've already mentioned more than once, if I come off as slightly defensive, it's because I am. I love spoilers, not in the sense that I tolerate them or don't mind them, but in the sense that I actively seek them out. I'd argue that my enjoyment of a text is actually increased by knowing key events, and we've talked about this on and off, right? I've always read books by reading the ending first and often jumping back and forth, and I often watch new episodes of my favorite shows by fast forwarding through it and only then sitting down to leisurely watch it. I want to make very clear that I do not want to convince anyone of my position or my preference. All I want to do is question the seeming truism that spoilers are bad, or said differently, I'm not out to proselytize anyone into my camp. I just want to draw attention to the fact that there are camps, different ways of reading, watching, listening, and that neither of them should be seen as aesthetically or ethically superior. Many years ago, two of my friends had the following exchange about reading and rereading in my journal. And I've gone back to this many times because it was such a perfect moment for me. The screenshot is from the end of the conversation, and I really love how their disagreement ultimately could be reduced to utterly incompatible approaches to new versus familiar material. Whereas one felt that rereading would be a waste of their time, the other enjoyed rereading so much that she felt, and I quote here, "New things are taking away from my rereading time." I don't want to conflate rereading and spoilers, but they are to me adjacent categories insofar as both value the familiar over the original, over the new. Sorry. Sorry. I'm on two computers and somehow, oh, I know what happened. I can't see my text. Augenblick. Auch noch eine andere. So, was passiert ist, ich kann nicht gleichzeitig, weil ich unfähig bin wahrscheinlich, ich kann nicht gleichzeitig mein Paper sehen und die
So have you the displays mirror? Have the display mirrored, or what did you do?
I got it. No, I have a second computer sitting in front of me, and the second computer just totally freaked out on me. Okay, I got it all. I got it all.
Okay.
And I'm like, with one keyboard, I go through these, and with the other keyboard, I'm trying to get my reading. So I got it. I opened a different program. In the following, I address some concerns that move a bit away from the topic of spoilers, but speak to the question of the aesthetic and ethical function of a text and how these get negotiated between readers and creators. First, I begin with a brief look at historical theories of authorship and their long-reaching philosophical, aesthetic, and legal influences. Second, I then look at ideas of authority and originality in the context of generic tropes and repetition to suggest that such literary frameworks may not fully work in particular genres and traditions. And, the keynote talk yesterday was really good about that. I suggest that in genre fiction, the reader-writer contract functions within a carefully generated and constantly revised framework where key elements are shared in paratextual materials. Fan fiction fans have been experimenting with current textual content clues such as headers and tagging systems for decades, and their discussions surrounding various models address some of the concerns raised in spoiler discourses. And then finally, I want to connect these tagging conventions both in fan and genre fiction to recent debates surrounding trigger warnings and content notes. Ultimately, I suggest desiring tags, warnings, or spoilers are all means through which readers control their reading experience. And if that control comes at the expense of a surprise twist or shocking moment, I, for one, find that rate well worthwhile. So, this is the first time I didn't print out my paper ahead of time, and I'm really regretting this right now. I am very usually old school. My printer is broken and I didn't want to go up to school. So if this talk has any specific argument, it is one about the negotiations between readers and writers and the ethical and aesthetic values we attach to their expected and actual interactions. I suggest that the discourses surrounding spoilers often rely on aesthetic values that privilege certain types of texts, namely those that value authenticity, originality, and genuine surprise. Moreover, the discourses surrounding spoilers often rely on a reading process that privileges the author, auteur, in favor of the reader or viewer. Obviously, as authors, they control what readers see. But there's the clear desire to also control how readers see. So beyond my desire to speak up as and for readers who want familiarity, like to reread, enjoy genre tropes, and want to access a text randomly and not necessarily linearly, I want to also suggest that there's a form of power struggle embedded in this conversation. Many contemporary readers want to be empowered in order to control if and when and how they want to engage with the text. As such, I look at the ever-growing popularities of tags as paratextual materials, as trigger and content warnings, but also as categorization and advertising tools, as a way to think through versions of spoilers that do not ruin or destroy, but instead facilitate and enhance audience enjoyments. And I should have probably trigger warned this image. People told me it's really bad, but this is a little bit how I feel, right? When someone says, you need to watch it this specific way, at this time, with these things doing or not doing on the side. One of the more commonplace truths held in contemporary literary studies is, at least in English, is that the 18th century invented the author. Certainly not all writing before was collective or anonymous, but the particular relationship between an author and his work underwent substantial changes during that time. Much of this is directly correlated to the shifting economic situation of artists and a need to legally protect one's creations. In a world of patronage, artists were supported by their patron and in turn could create and share their creations. In literature then, support was more general, not an essay by essay, word by word reimbursement. However, with changing market economies and a rapidly rising middle-class readership, the 18th century writers increasingly started living off their works and thus demanded legal protection and economic reimbursement. Authorial copyright offered writers a way to establish ownership over their works and the possibility for a livelihood. It is not surprising then that copyright embraced and in a way needed an aesthetic theory that emphasized the individual creation. Nor is it surprising that in an era that foregrounds the individual and his rights and abilities, these two ideas, original genius and intellectual copyright, came to the fore. In order to theoretically justify the ownership of his literary creation, this new concept of the author made him the sole creator and owner of the words in his book and established the law of author's rights as a natural law. Such theories that elevate the author, creator, auteur are strikingly self-serving. The artwork becomes an abstract object that ideally carries with it its own aesthetic value and ideal interpretation, as well as proper form of reception and ideal audience. So my beloved behated William Wordsworth is very noteworthy here because he actually, he was one of the big theorists of English Romanticism, and his theory focused on imagination and originality. Even where he acknowledges external stimuli and inspiration, the poetic genius remains central to creating and shaping the artistic work. In the 1815 supplement to his seminal preface to the lyrical ballads, he defines the genius as the introduction of a new element into the intellectual universe. As such, he defines as most valuable a thinking and writing that is radically new and different, that is original rather than transformative of older ideas. And he clearly needs such a definition, and this is where it gets interesting, in order to establish authors as owners of ideas, ideas as commodities that can be owned and sold. In fact, he worked together with a member of parliament to extend copyright in Great Britain. So he basically used himself and his theories to justify for him to make money longer. So this illustrates clearly the connection between the legal notion of copyright, the economic notion of ownership of ideas, and the artistic notion of original genius. To our end, Germany's Sturm und Drang period elevated the concept of the Originalgenie as a paradigm of creativity, original, autonomous, rebellious. Nevertheless, here too, aesthetic and philosophical arguments were deployed to undergird a clearly economic interest. In his aesthetic theory, Adorno juxtaposes romantic ideology and Enlightenment philosophy with earlier artistic practices where material was easily repurposed. He emphasizes the historical element of the concept of originality and its socioeconomic connections, insofar as originality is, and I quote here, enmeshed in historical injustice and the predominance of bourgeois commodities that must touch up the ever same as the ever new in order to win customers. You gotta like the old school Marxists. Here, the concept of the new is intricately bound up with economic concerns in the same way copyright laws establish aesthetic criteria for the purposes of settling economically relevant issues. In fact, there are clear parallels between the public commons that were moved into private ownership with the enclosure movement of the 18th century and an intellectual commons that suddenly ascribed ownership to ideas previously commonly shared. And this is the last thing on this history stuff, but to complicate matters even further, this increasing valorization of creativity and originality is heavily gendered. It is the truth universally acknowledged that the English novel was not invented by Richardson and Fielding, but that there was a much longer history of women writing. Yet it was not until men began to write novels that the domestic hobby became a public profession. Martha Woods Munsey, who has written about this at length, described the aspect of female authorship that made it antithetical to the newly created author as original genius. And I quote, in its amateur origins and rather narrowly defined utilitarian purpose, the novel would seem to lack the earmark of literary art. The product of idle hours, it is intended not for sale to a reading public, but strictly for domestic use. And I mean, one of the reasons I'm so invested in this is exactly what we're seeing in fandom, right? When women are writing for fun, the first thing everyone says is like, why aren't you selling it? You should be writing your original ideas, right? There's this constant, unless it's commercial, it's not worthwhile. And of course, it's gendered. In other words, the way women created art was wrong on several counts. They did not do it for money or to share in the public space. The emphasis was on craft and amateur status rather than any sense of original genius. Their works effectively had to be ignored because the ideological context in which it was crafted spoke directly against the aesthetic models man needed to create in order to justify owning and selling their works. Of course, the myth of the original genius is neither universal nor disinterested. Different periods of literary and philosophical thought place emphasis more strongly on either continuity or originality, though most use elements of both. And, you know, at least the older ones amongst us in English read the, what is it? The Something and the Lamp. Someone help me. I didn't write that down. I shouldn't extemporaneously do anything. Is it Spirit and the Lamp? Mirror in the Lamp, The Mirror in the Lamp, Abrams, right? One is the total reflection and one is the genius of the lamp. And yet the romantic aesthetics of privileging originality and artistic genius created a value system that still affects the landscape of contemporary Western culture. In fact, modernity has tended to favor, and modernism very highly so, has tended to favor aesthetics that heavily rely on originality and difference. In turn, as a fan scholar and as a fan, I have a vested interest in foregrounding the inherent aesthetic values of repetition. Rather than replacing an aesthetics of originality with one of repetition, however, I merely want to draw attention to the interplay between these two seemingly opposing forces that both are central to any creative process. Moreover, with my very cursory historical comments, I want to suggest that we've created an aesthetic landscape that all but dismisses the types of creativity that do not rely on originality and thus cannot be spoiled. So I'd argue that all of these components are strongly intertwined. Modern conceptions of authorship, aesthetic value judgments that privilege originality, and the dismissal of popular literatures and genre writing, and of course, fan fiction. In my day job, I'm an adjunct professor in a philosophy department. So one of the courses I teach this semester is classical mythology. And I spent a not insubstantial amount of my class time spoiling my students because they don't have the background, they don't know anything. When we start the Iliad, they not only need to know the main characters and their internal strife, but also the complicated reasons why the gods favor or loathe specific characters aside. So we go back through like all of mythology just to get to the point where they can understand what's going on in the text. After all, the complex background mythologies would be well-known facts to those hearing or reading the epic throughout antiquity and beyond. In fact, looking at the continued popularity of ancient mythological stories, can we actually talk about spoilers when reviewing or recommending any of the books up here, which were all in the last 10 years and all were really popular? You may have read some of them. Because familiarity with the source material will deepen the enjoyment rather than take away from it, as small allusions, characters, or references effectively provide Easter eggs for those in the know, namely those with a classical background. It is not incidental that these books all constitute what US copyright law has termed transformative works. Classic transformative works, and you can fight me on that, such as the Aeneid, the Divine Comedy, or Paradise Lost, and more recent transformative works such as Costello's Cassandra, Greg Maguire's Wicked, Tom Stoppard's Rosenberg, and Guildenstern Are Dead, offer layers of intertextuality. Worthwhile reads on their own, knowledge of the source text provides added enjoyment and comprehension. White Sargasso Sea is a wonderful novel in its own right, but it gains immeasurably when read against its primary intertext, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. It gives voice to Rochester's first wife, and with it confronts questions of class, gender, and colonialism that remain repressed and unexplored in the original Victorian novel. My main research is in the field of fan fiction, which constitute another form of transformative work, primarily using audiovisual popular cultural texts as their basis, and primarily published for a dedicated community of fellow fans. As a result, fan fiction can become all but incomprehensible when taken out of its very specific contextual time and place. Fan fiction is deeply intertextual on multiple levels, with the source text, obviously, with the cultural popular texts of the time, and most unusually, but importantly, with the artifacts shared within the fan community, including other stories, memes, fan art, widely shared analyses of shows, characters, fandoms. I want to be clear here that I'm not arguing that fan fiction is qualitatively different from any other artwork, which also is created in conversation with many other cultural moments. However, in fan fiction, the communities are often so small and insular that one can actually trace the various influences. In another talk I gave, I actually showed how someone just said, hey, we don't have MPreg in our fandom. And then someone else wrote a story and someone else wrote a story. So like you could actually trace the moment where the thought started and then see all the stories and fan art and vids that came out of it. As a result, when fan fiction is removed from its context, it is often less engaging and less enjoyable than it is for a fan who's deeply embedded in the fandom. This is really important. The more the reader knows about the show, including potential paratexts, the fandom and its creative artifacts, and the conversations among the fans, the more layers of understanding and hopefully enjoyment they will have. Moreover, fan fiction challenges many of our traditional ideas of originality. After all, the fanish experience is all about repetition. Fans rewatch favorite shows to get to all the nuances, but they also rewatch simply because they enjoy reviewing certain scenes and spending time with favorite characters. On a more crucial level, fan fiction celebrates repetition on all levels. Its raison d'etre is a repeat engagement with the worlds and characters. For Francesca Coppa, the repeated retelling of the same story, ever so slightly different, situates fan fiction actually closer to drama than fiction. She says, in literary terms, fan fiction's repetition is strange. In theater, stories are retold all the time. Like theater, the script is only the starting point, and like theater, the actual performance, the specific implementation and reimagining matters. We're happy to see Hamlet as a US college student and Faust in the 21st century. Likewise, a Marvel fan may enjoy Thor working as a barista or Bucky Barnes as an Iraq war veteran. In the interpretive and analytic encounters, fans will return to a particular moment in the source again and again, telling the story over and over again, playing out every possible minor variation, feeling, and response. For fans, there can never be just one story, but instead fans want the same moment explored in many different ways. Fan fiction is variations on a theme, repetition with a difference. Within this context, repetition serves an important function that may indeed be necessary for creative works and their reception. Language can only ever be meaningful if it is recognizable, that is, if it is repeated. That is true on the level of the letter, the word, and the sentence, but it is true even on the level of narrative itself. I mean, that's what we're all studying, right? How to make sense of, how to organize, how to sort. Just like pure difference on the linguistic level would resemble speaking in tongues, a story that doesn't engage any recognizable generic narrative, whether by following or defying specific expectations and tropes, would create a story difficult to parse for the reader. Complete originality, with all familiar and recognizable narrative conventions removed, may engender a narrative so incomprehensible that the reader cannot understand it, let alone aesthetically appreciate it. In contrast, stories that employ familiar themes and narratives establish a groundwork of comprehension within which they then can challenge or subvert these shared paradigms. As such, recognizing familiar themes is an important step when approaching and categorizing texts, especially within fan fiction. Rather than thinking of genre as a fixed taxonomical system inherent in the text, more recent approaches understand genre as a constructed and ever-shifting category that gets created in the interplay between producers, audiences, and cultural contexts. And Jason Mattel is one of the people who has written that extensively. He's come up a couple of times already. What that means is that interpretation of texts shift with context and with readers, that personal and cultural context, as well as industry marketing and circulation, may indeed shape generic expectations. Fandom, of course, complicates any clear producer paratext audience reception dichotomy because roles and modes of engagement shift constantly in fandom. Most fans are creators, readers, and critics in turn. And fan works are assigned to genres, tropes, categories by all of the participants. Generic categorization thus is often created via a taxonomy with fans as creators, recommenders, feedbackers, and readers. Indeed, it is those very cliches, tropes, repetitions found in genre entertainment and in fan fiction that often figure centrally in our comprehension and pleasure. Genre and generic tropes are one of the central building blocks of fan fiction and fanish discourse. Many mailing lists and archives communities require generic markers, and many readers search specifically by generic tropes and even create rec lists for them. This is a difficult concept to grasp for literary scholars who often approach genre writing as formulaic and tropes as cliches. In fan fiction, however, generic tropes are a feature, not a bug. Reading texts in an incredibly context interplay between memory and expectation, between anticipating and retroactively rearranging information and events. Genre categories offer readers and viewers directions in a variety of ways. They allow us clues for how to understand the text. They guide reader expectations. They offer pleasure in the familiar, fulfilling expectations, and they enable us to anticipate the plot and characterization, whether by fulfilling or defying genre categories. Where paratextual materials offer the reader a host of information before even beginning the story, generic tropes create clear expectations throughout the text that the reader will expect to be fulfilled to a certain degree at least. Janice Radway, in her famous study of romance readers, says how repetition is the rule, not the exception, and that reading, in a sense, becomes a form of rereading, and readers exhibit fairly rigid expectations about what is permissible and express disappointment and outrage when those conventions are violated. So someone here was doing genre romance, yes. Happily ever after is one of the big debates that people will argue, because there are some people who say romance by definition hasn't happily ever after, and then there's some people who want to stretch this definition, but the readers really on the whole seem to push back and say, no, I don't want to read a story, at best a happily for now, but I don't want the characters to die. That just isn't romance then. So I will now get actually to the fanfic stuff. I will offer a brief excursion into the history of fanfiction headers and tags, because fan communities were early adapters and adopters, if not actually mentors, of robust paratextual tagging conventions that have recently spilled over into parts of professional fiction. In fact, many of the conversations we're now seeing on book sites and in academic contexts are debates that rolled through fan communities a decade ago or more. Traditionally, fan fiction started to formalize certain shared conventions during the zine days in the 70s and 80s. And up there are a couple of covers of zines. Down there is a mimeograph machine. A process that became more uniform in the 90s when fan fiction moved online. In Star Trek fandom, one of the most important labels was the question of whether Kirk and Spock are friends or romantically involved. There were humongous battles in the late 70s about this. This convention led to the term slash. So if you've heard the term slash, it comes from the virgule, the dash there between the two names to denote homosexual romantic pairings, and showcased how the label functioned both as advertisement and warning. In her essay on trigger warnings, Alexis Lothian describes how, and I quote, "Warnings functioned as an author-led system of identification, flagging sexually explicit content with keep-out signs, allowing the uninterested to avoid the uncomfortable while also marking the entryway to secret worlds of erotic kinship." Fan writers and publishers clearly identified their zines not only with fandom and central characters' appearings, but also declared whether the content was adult or not, and whether it was hetero or homosexual. So the two on the right both have the term KS on the cover, and the one on the left is explicit enough that people know what they're getting. However, as I was talking to an older fan, she kept reminding me, you actually didn't get to see most of this stuff because it was literally under the table at conventions. And when you ordered it via mail, you had to do an H statement. And on the left, I have here, premiering April 19th, under the table at Anglicon. And then this is a slash scene, please send an H statement. The con panels discussing these stories were put on after dark only. Not all of the slash scenes made it through customs when they were shipped internationally. So there was a lot of pressure on, kind of keeping it on the down low. Tagging in fanzines developed so that readers wouldn't be exposed to material they preferred not to read. And by the time fandom moved online in the late 80s, early 90s, fanish conventions and early internet conventions for Usenet, alt-sex communities, cross-connected to establish fairly standardized fanfiction headers. And this is really interesting because there were a bunch of different alt-TV creative news groups, but they all kind of ended up with very similar rules, very similar headers within just a couple of years. So on the left, you can see from, I had the date on it, the left was from 94, right? The story is copyrighted by the author in 94. The one on the right is 1998. And the left is still very narrative, right? The story is NC-17, it's gonna have sex, it's gonna have gay sex. Did it have gay sex? I don't even remember. The one on the right is already kind of having this header format that you then continue to see to this day. And Abigail Derecho, who studied this and went through a lot of old archives, describes how significant this first group was in terms of setting up templates and rules and precedents that other online groups followed. So this is around from the same time, I'd say from the 90s, just looking at the visuals. It's very 90s look. And you can see here that we have title, author, series are all recommended, but then what I'm interested in is the content codes. And if you look at it, it says the content codes come directly from ISEK stories. So the content codes were taken from other Usenet communities to kind of say, yes, those are really good terms to warn for, to tell people this is going to be in here. And as you can see, it's mostly sex and violence. But of course, for every reader who wanted to avoid non-con stories or stories featuring torture or character death, there were readers who were looking for these stories specifically. Early archives allowed simple sorting by publication. So these were both from the X-Files Gossamer archive, which only sorted by alphabet basically and by date time. But by the late 90s, a fan actually created an interface that was an archive with a search function, which was incredibly popular, and a lot of single fandom archives adopted this. It had a set vocabulary, so you could put in which words it was searching for. But then, the reader had to use these words and the authors had to use these words. You can make a larger vocabulary, but it was a set vocabulary. So this is from 852 Prospect, which was an archive for the Sentinel, a 90s cop procedural. And if you go to different fandoms, you can see some of the things that the fans found important to notice and to talk about. So we wouldn't have normally a warning for partner betrayal, but in a fandom that is very invested in their two main characters being together and not cheating on each other, those are huge, huge warnings that need to be addressed if you have a story that has that. The multiple partners is another one that doesn't seem to be on the same level as rape, right? But they were all kind of on that level. So this is what this did. So here's a wonderful quote I found on Tumblr a couple of weeks ago. I need everyone to understand that modern tagging practices have become so wonderfully specific and easy to filter and search. They're like the build your own pizza option on online pizza ordering. You want a non-pizza with left beef, guess what? You can get it, contactless delivery, no problem. Her comfort with oblivious pining and mild yes vibes, hold the character death. Yep. Whereas early days of fic were more like if when you ordered a pizza, the delivery driver just chucked a cardboard box at you from the window of their sedan, and as they peeled away, yelled, "It's probably a calzone." You generally only knew the fandom, the pairing if applicable, and whatever the author felt like writing as a summary, which was often one line back in the day. So this kind of is a very passionate, impassioned, recommendation of the current system that is very strongly on sorting in and out of certain terms. But I also want to show this to you to show you the exact opposite of the set vocabulary, which is what we call Tumblr tags. At the bottom, you can see these are totally freeform tags. There is no kind of guiding principle or hierarchy. It's basically just a narrative in tags. So you have on the one hand the set vocabulary, which is very limiting, and on the other hand you have the freeform tags, which give the posters a lot of control, but you can't really sort them well. So the solution is what we came up with for AO3. So I'm going to talk a little bit about AO3 because in 2007, a group of fan fiction fans came together to create their ideal archive. With a nod to Virginia Woolf, they named it Archive of Our Own and created an entire nonprofit, the Organization for Transformative Works, to offer a legal, academic, and historical framework. As we saw with zines and 90s archives, fans had learned long ago that every platform wasn't built by and for fans. Every platform that wasn't built by and for fans would eventually exploit and/or limit our content. And in May 2007, both threats became explicit. A venture company tried to monetize fan fiction and exploit fans while limiting their creativity. Their proposal was geared towards the media industry with fan fiction writers as free content providers. Meanwhile, LiveJournal, one of the central online platforms and archival repositories for many fan fiction fans at the time, was pressured to delete communities and journals that addressed and posted pornographic content. So there was a Nabokov discussion community that was deleted. And it was, very clear that we were under threat. It's like, if someone doesn't like what we're writing, they're going to delete our communities, and we can't do anything about it because this is not our space, right? So the lessons that AO3 and its supporters learned was that, one, we need to own our servers, and we do, because anytime we depended on commercial platforms, we'd be prey to financial considerations. And two, we needed to not use advertisement as support, because again, we'd open ourselves up to commercial pressure because the advertisers will say, we want this gone, or we're not going to give you money. As you can tell from the AO3's front page, at the moment, this is from last week, it hosts close to 9 million works and nearly 50,000 fandoms and a total of 4.5 million users that are actually registered. And we're still in beta, so you still need an invite to join. I spent so much time on this archive, for one, because I've been involved with the OTW from its beginning, have served on the board of directors, and have been running the academic fan studies journal TWC. There it is. That is one of the OTW's projects. More importantly, however, the archive has created a complex tagging system with a robust inclusion-exclusion search function that uses both standardized mandatory and free-form voluntary tags. We call that a curated taxonomy that uses the taxonomy terms, but at the same time kind of tries to organize them, which is a lot of work. To begin with, the archive requires certain tags comparable to the traditional headers, but then users can add modifiers as user-generated freeform tags. So where fixed taxonomies limit users to pre-established categories, taxonomies suffer from a lack of consensus, which makes it difficult to organize. In order to maintain a shared fixed base vocabulary, yet permit user creativity in tags, AO3 uses this curated taxonomy that mixes user-defined and controlled vocabulary, and then volunteers behind the scenes actually match it up. And this is what happens. So you can have down here, for example, all these different ways to write and misspell dyslexia, and they will all go into the same dyslexia label. They will all match together. And then dyslexia is also under learning disability, which is under disability. So anything that is tagged dyslexia will also come up if you do learning disability and search for that, will also come up if you search disability in general. So there's the hierarchy, and there's kind of a matching so that people can use different terms to get you to the same spot and be like in the same pot. These volunteers, called tag wranglers, will organize the tags that fit into already existing structures. They can relate the tag to others bearing the same meaning with only different spelling, can sort the tag into a hierarchical structure. This means that writers have all the freedom of a taxonomy, while the system nevertheless retains some of the hierarchical structures and searchabilities of a proper taxonomy. So this is just, you can actually look just at the tags, and you can see what is popular. This dual system allows readers to micromanage their reading preferences, including and excluding a large number of desired categories and tags. In fact, I'm mostly interested in tags because fandom organizes itself through the way we tag stories. And content tags function as a conceptual framework that guides reading and understanding, back to our genre tropes. Even more interestingly, however, I believe that tags and the generic tropes they often embody affect fans' general perception and particular interpretation of characters and events. Tags thus are highly efficient and very visible ways in which interpretive communities share interpretations that guide readings of the fan works, influence interpretations of the source text, and may even generate new fictions in their wake. So what I'm saying here is that we have, like, I don't know, Steve is my cinnamon roll, right? If someone writes that, you kind of know what kind of vision of Captain America this author is going to have, and other people will either read it or not read it depending on that. So you give kind of certain additional information to people in the know when you give your tags. But this is where it is right now. You can include and exclude all of these different terms and just write in tags that you want. So you can look for very, very specific things, as the calzone person above described. While header conventions with contact tags have not changed much in the past 2 decades, the conversation surrounding them completely reframed the issue about a decade ago. Way before the warning label was a polite way to warn readers of topics they disliked, the discourse shifted to warning labels as a mandatory requirement to enable readers to avoid potential triggers. Drawing from PTSD terminology, the conversation quickly moved from issues of reading preferences and readerly comfort to disability concerns. If a story does not list clear triggers, then the writer consciously refuses to create a safe space and thus endangers traumatized readers. Fan Things with Wings, for example, represents this new understanding of tags as accessibility when arguing in favor of trigger warnings here in 2010. When artistic freedom is framed as the freedom to make people feel uncomfortable, it sounds really cool until you remember that the word uncomfortable also covers up for words like triggered and flashback and panicked and freaked out. Art can certainly disturb in powerful and even useful ways. But when we talk about that, we don't mean that it ought to trigger PTSD flashbacks or migraines. It is this tag genealogy that connects tags in fan fiction fandom to trigger warning debates in classrooms and various online spaces. And here in an article, Elie Vingiano describes the phrase trigger warning evolved from clinical psychiatry, moved from live journal fan fiction to Tumblr to mainstream media, and eventually ended up on college syllabi. Personally, and this is just my own reading of tags, so I've just threw this slide in. Personally, I find it most useful to think of warning tags as a paratextual way to negotiate the reader-writer contract. Fanfiction fandom has historically been understood as a feminist space, and it is within the context that warning discourses make sense. I mostly follow the brilliant insight of a fellow fan friend who conceptualized warnings as a request for consent. So this is the drifter saying, warnings are the author's request for consent. By continuing past cut tags, headers, and preliminary pages, the reader implicitly consents to what may follow. As readers, we're responsible for knowing our own limits, our own boundaries, and crossing those limits with forethought and care. In fact, I have an essay on non-confiction in my book, and the way these stories tend to be framed both within the story, but also in its paratextual material. Drawing from BDSM culture, I conceptualize headers as risk-aware consensual kink, where both sides commit to something. The writer promises that these are the features that the story will contain, and furthermore, that it does not contain others that collectively are considered noteworthy. In turn, the reader takes responsibility for her own reading experience when opening the story. So I want to show you what this looks like if you haven't been to the AO3 or just any archive that is tag heavy. So this is a story. It's a Captain America story written in 2016. It's almost 300,000 words, which I looked that up, is the length of Middlemarch, Ulysses, Outlander, and a Game of Thrones. So we always talk about stories, but some of them are epic novels. People have visited this, so the hits are, 78,000, but what's more interesting is the kudos, because kudos can only be given once by one reader to the story. So however many chapters, however often you read the story, there's one kudo you may give. So there are at least 2,800 people who read the story, liked the story, and decided to put kudos on it. What's interesting about the additional tags is that you see a wide variety of, that's why I like the term content tags, because they're not necessarily trigger warnings, they're not even content warnings, they're just descriptions, right? So there's military kink, there's ableism, there's femsteve, and if those are things that you're interested in, you may want to read the story. If those are things that you squick on, that you find offensive, you may not want to. And here is the same story in a bookmarking site. So this is readers now going and using tags. And some of the tags are the same that the author uses. Sometimes people add their own tags, which then becomes a problem when this spills over into published fiction. So here are a couple of content notes for published stories, kind of the typical stuff: abuse, manipulation, sex trafficking. I like the one on the left because it says, it contains self-harm and emotional abuse, but then it says a full list of content warnings is available on my website. So it kind of balances this. Some people don't want to know, and it gives it another place. Like in fan archives, a lot of times it says, go to the end of the story for more detailed warnings. But these are my favorite find. These are actually books. They're tags in books. And if you know anything about fandom, all the fields is very much a fanish term. Like this is someone using Tumblr tags for a published book to give us the tags. And the meta commentary and the kind of conversation with the reader is very typical here. So I'm skipping here because I really want to get to this. Okay, not quite that. So I used Outlander for some reason. And this is a review site. So this is people going there and saying, I want to read or write reviews on this story. So they have a couple of tags. And in fact, they have a set vocabulary. If you look here, these are the terms you can search for on the website. So you can look for age gap. You can exclude age gap, included, epistolary romance, enemies to lovers. So there's both content and just kind of formal features. And here is StoryGraph. I don't know how many of you have been to StoryGraph or know this. StoryGraph is amazing. StoryGraph is like Goodreads, but like so much more reader friendly and so much more author hostile. So in StoryGraph, readers submit their own tags to what they think the book is about or what they want to warn other people. And you can weigh it by how many people give that tag. Clearly, we have rape in Outlander. That's not really a spoiler. 138 people decided that that was a, very graphic. There's also immediate and lesser warnings. Racial slurs, xenophobia, we have one person for each. So that seems to be something very idiosyncratic. So, your mileage may vary how you're reading this, but the important point is it's not the author, but it's the readers putting the content in. So last year, these are 3 headlines from like summer and fall. Authors were getting very upset, and it was specifically about StoryGraph and this idea that authors are not in control of what is being said about their books. I always have this image of authors running behind their books and telling readers how to read it. That's how I sometimes feel when they say, oh, you're misreading this. It's like, no, I'm reading your book. This is all you gave me. Like, you cannot run behind and interpret it for me. But here are some Twitter comments from the author of Mexican Gothic and Aidan Thomas, who wrote Cemetery Boys, on how upset they were with the tags that were added for their books on StoryGraph. So Silvia Moreno Garcia points out these tags can be wildly inaccurate. And someone content warned one of my works for poverty, another one for animal death. The StoryGraph lists Mexican Gothic for cannibalism as explicit, moderate, and mild. Which one is it? A little bite or a buffet? So she was more complaining about, that there's context missing, and that, they're very idiosyncratic and different people may feel differently, and that doesn't give you a good sense. And then on the next day, she said, by the way, right there are multiple threads saying to fuck me because people are saying I attacked reviewers. At this point, I've written, I think, 3 threads about how trigger warnings can be weaponized and used against people of color by taking works out of context, and that's what's happening to me now. And Aidan Thomas makes the same content because people were upset about bloodletting in his novel, and he says, this is ritualistic bloodletting and sacrifice. It has a completely different meaning. You shouldn't trigger warn for that. I wish I could end with a simple and clear conclusion, especially as the last speaker of the conference, but there are no clear answers because different creators and audiences desire different ways of engaging with texts. I have suggested that a shift from originality to repetition and genre challenges concepts of literary quality, but I'm well aware that to remain in one's comfort zone always may impoverish our creative engagement with the world. I've described a power discourse between authors and readers, but as my last quote suggests, these conversations can be weaponized and don't always occur in good conscience. If there's anything I can unequivocally say, is that it's that their readers and viewers love spoilers, and that offering spaces for them makes them neither wrong nor challenged, but merely indicates different tastes and different approaches to reading, viewing, and enjoyment. I wonder then whether spoilers and their rejection and tagging requests develop concurrently or even interdependently. Both seem to be instances of convergence culture, these ever closer ties and interactions among creators, marketing, and audiences from within fanish spaces for the past 2 decades. Henry Jenkins, who popularized the term, argues that fans are early adapters and adopters, and the last decade has proven what he projected. With the fanification of culture, these complex interactions and influences would begin affecting all media consumers. Moreover, with Web 2.0, or right now even 3.0, everyone has become a content creator. In an age of bloggers, YouTube celebrities, Instagram influencers, and TikTok music hits, clear lines of text and paratext, author and reader, amateur and professional are disappearing. And just possibly both tagging practices and spoiler fears are responses to culture that is ever more pushed onto us rather than sought out and pulled by us. And I think I mentioned that yesterday, that that's really something I've been thinking about. Maybe it might make most sense to look at the demands for spoiler warnings as well as for content notes as two sides of the same coin: self-protection and defense against an ever-invasive social media culture where readers, audiences, consumers want to control their experience, whether that means not knowing who survives the film or checking ahead of time if the dog dies. Thank you very much.